The DeLoreans had been at peace for generations. No thoughts about human warships, not a single soul in their world expecting a sudden attack from the void. Zetrix Var's role as a sky watcher was considered necessary by some, but most DeLoreans saw it as a waste of resources, occasionally going so far as to say that the cost of radar maintenance and Zetrix Var's salary was hardly justified. Zetrix Var shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his slender frame poorly suited to the ancient chair's ergonomics. His translucent skin, a mottled blend of azure and violet that was considered unremarkable among his kind, seemed to change color with each cycle of the observation tower's dim lighting. His elongated limbs, typical of DeLorean's physiology, folded awkwardly as he adjusted himself. 5 narrow fingers on each hand splayed across the control panel as he conducted the system checks. His synthetic uniform, a lightweight material designed to regulate body temperature in the isolated tower, hung loosely from his angular shoulders. The material neither breathed nor constricted, simply existed as a formality, a reminder that his position, despite its perceived uselessness, maintained some vestige of official status. The collar bore the faded insignia of the DeLorean Sky Authority, an institution that commanded as much respect these days as ancient rain predictors had before meteorological science. The observation cabin itself was minimalistic and even neglected, a circular room no wider than 10 paces across, its walls curved upward to a domed ceiling where ancient light fixtures shone with inconsistent intensity. The radar array panel dominated one side of the room, a semicircular console of buttons, displays, and indicators that had seen neither maintenance nor upgrade in decades, if not centuries. Most of the displays flickered with what Zetrix Var assumed was routine atmospheric conditions, though he could not recall his training well enough to be certain. A single chair, his chair, sat bolted to the floor before this altar of obsolescence. The metal flooring, once polished to a reflective shine, now bore the scuff marks of generations of bored skywatchers. The windows that ringed the upper portion of the cabin offered a panoramic view of the DeLorean capital city, Celestia, stretching toward the horizon in gentle, flowing architecture that mirrored the ocean from which their civilization had emerged. The contrast between the ancient technology inside the cabin and the elegant, advanced society beyond its walls was not lost on Zetrix Var. He was, after all, a relic guardian in a post-relic world. On the opposite side of the room, from the primary console, partially obscured by the shadow of an unused storage compartment, sat a curious anomaly in the otherwise barren space, a red button. Unlike the faded controls of the main panel, this button retained a vibrant crimson hue, protected beneath a transparent cover that had yellowed with age. No labels adorned it, no instructions flanked it, just a singular, ominous presence that had gone untouched for longer than any living DeLorean could remember. The button's purpose was as much a matter of mythology as fact. Zetrix Var had been told, during his abbreviated training, that it was to be pressed in the event of an alien invasion. This instruction, delivered with a dismissive wave by his predecessor, seemed ludicrous given that the concept of invasion had become theoretical at best. The DeLoreans had withdrawn from galactic affairs generations ago, their planet considered too resource-poor and their species too passive to warrant conquest. Neither Zetrix Var nor the long line of skywatchers before him knew precisely what would happen should the button ever be pressed. An emergency alert to a defensive system long since disassembled? A planetary shield that might or might not still function? Or perhaps, as nervous humor sometimes suggested, simply a test to see if anyone was paying attention at all. Over the years, 3 full orbits of Deloria around its sun, Zetrix Var had found himself contemplating that button with increasing frequency. At first, the thoughts were dismissive, even amused, a relic of an age when his species still believed themselves significant enough to warrant protection. But as the monotony of his days accumulated, like the dust on the transparent cover, the button transformed in his mind. It became a symbol of the untested, an unexplored pathway, the single element in his daily existence that remained mysterious, unpredictable. During particularly tedious shifts, when the radar showed nothing but the expected atmospheric debris and occasional spacefaring vessels of fellow DeLoreans, Zetrix Var allowed himself to imagine scenarios that would justify pressing it. Meteors on collision course, the return of the mythical ancient ones that featured in DeLorean children's tales, or, most absurdly, actual invaders, though who would bother with Deloria remained beyond even his most fanciful speculation. Sometimes, during the depths of night cycles when the city beyond his windows slept and even the most diligent of his species had retreated to their recuperation chambers, Zetrix Var would approach the button. He would stand before it with his eyes fixed on its perfect redness, two hearts accelerating in his chest, fingers flexing, with a curious mixture of desire and restraint. He had never touched the transparent cover. Such an act seemed somehow sacred, forbidden, but he had come close. Close enough to see his own reflection, distorted by the curved surface, a strange, elongated version of himself that seemed almost like a visitor from another reality. The years of seeing it there, untouched, only intensified this strange desire. The button had become an obsession, a focus for his frustrated energy in a job that demanded nothing of him. He sometimes wondered if his predecessor had felt the same, and the one before that, an unspoken lineage of Skywatchers, united across time by their secret fixation with the one thing they must never do. Zetrix Var glanced at the time display. A mere 47 intervals remained in his shift. Soon, he could return to his modest dwelling in the eastern quadrant of Celestia, perhaps engage in some of the mental stimulation puzzles that had become his primary distraction from the emptiness of his professional existence. He had recently acquired a new quantum probability cube, a complex toy that adjusted its solution parameters with each attempt to solve it. Such diversions were all that kept his mind from atrophying entirely in the face of his meaningless vigil. He leaned back in his chair, allowing his eyes to unfocus slightly as they drifted across the upper radar display, paying no attention at all. The screen had been divided into several sectors during some long-forgotten era of actual vigilance, and despite the fact he was missing it completely, there was something unusual in there. 10 small red dots had appeared there, clustered near the orbital path of the system's outermost gas giant. Had Zetrix Var been properly trained, had the procedural knowledge not been diluted through generations of disinterested Skywatchers, he might have recognized this as the alert pattern for unauthorized vessels entering Delurian space. But such knowledge had faded, replaced by rote button-pressing and screen-watching devoid of understanding. The dots blinked steadily, their urgent message lost on their sole observer as Zetrix Var's attention drifted to the weather patterns displayed on the lower screens. A storm front was moving in from the western seas. Perhaps it would break the uncomfortable humidity that had persisted in Celestia for the past 30 cycles. He made a mental note to extend his dwelling's weather shields before retiring for the night. His datapad chimed from the pocket of his uniform, distracting him further. A message from the Cultural Preservation Ministry. Another budget reduction for non-essential historical operations. The Skywatching program had survived dozens of such cuts over the years, whittled down to a single observer in a single tower. Zetrix Var wondered, not for the first time, if he would be the last of his kind, the final Skywatcher of Deluria, an evolutionary dead end in a profession that had lost its purpose. As he scrolled through the Ministry's lengthy justification for the latest cuts, his water bottle, a simple metallic cylinder with his identification markings etched into its side, tipped over, emptying its contents across a portion of the rarely used secondary control panel. With a resigned sigh, Zetrix Var rose from his chair, his jolts protesting the sudden movement after hours of inactivity. He crossed the room to the modest hydration station, his back to the main radar display where the red dots had now increased to 15, their pattern shifting to indicate approach vectors toward the inner system. The water bottle refilled slowly, and Zetrix Var took a long drink, his tertiary throat bladder expanding to store excess fluid for later consumption, an evolutionary adaptation from his species' distant past. He moved unhurriedly back to his station, his gaze passing across the upper display with the disinterest of routine, and then he stopped. His eyes blinked in a weird sequence, a DeLorean expression of surprise. He leaned closer to the screen, pupils contracting to thin circles as they focused intently on the red dots. 15 of them now, moving in a formation that seemed too orderly for natural phenomena.
"What in the 7 moons?"
he muttered, the words emerging as a series of soft clicks and whistles in his native tongue. He rubbed his eyes with the back of his hands, the webbing between his fingers folding uncomfortably against his face. When he looked again, the dots remained, their movement now unmistakably deliberate. Something cold settled in his digestive systems. For several moments, Zetrix Var simply froze, his mind struggling to process information it had never been trained to handle. The red dots, clearly not atmospheric anomalies, continued their steady progression through the outer system. Invaders? The words seemed absurd, pulled from historical dramas rather than reality. Yet what else could they be? Unregistered DeLorean ships would have broadcast identification codes. Recognized allied species, though Deloria had no active alliances, would have followed established approach protocols. The possibility that the ancient system itself might be malfunctioning occurred to him then. These displays had operated continuously for longer than most technological systems were designed to function. Perhaps this was simply the beginning of its inevitable failure. Random patterns misinterpreted by equipment too old to distinguish between signal and noise. As he debated with himself, precious minutes passed. The dots continued their inward journey, their pattern shifting slightly as they navigated the gravitational influence of the gas giant. They moved with obvious purpose, with intelligence, and Zetrix Var, despite his desperate desire to dismiss them, could no longer deny what he was seeing. Then, like a lightning strike across his consciousness, he remembered the button. The red button, the invasion button, the never-to-be-pressed except in the most dire circumstances button. His head snapped toward the shadowed corner where it waited, untouched for generations. In this moment of crisis, and he could no longer pretend it was anything else, he had nearly forgotten the one procedure he was absolutely certain of. Zetrix Var lunged from his chair with such suddenness that the ancient piece of furniture toppled backward, clattering against the metal floor with a sound that seemed to echo the alarm bells ringing in his mind. His lanky form moved with uncharacteristic urgency, crossing the observation cabin in 3 long strides. He reached for the button, fingers extending towards its protective cover, only to meet the unexpected resistance of the transparent shield. In all his fantasies of pressing the button, he had somehow glossed over this detail. The cover, the safety mechanism, the barrier between impulse and action. His fingers scrabbled against the smooth surface, seeking purchase on edges that had been designed to be opened methodically, not frantically pried at by panicked digits. After several futile attempts, he located a small indentation at the base of the cover. He pressed his thumb into it, feeling something give way with the reluctant acquiescence of long disused mechanics. The cover lifted, the seal breaking for the first time in what must have been decades. Zetrix Var didn't hesitate. He pressed down firmly on the red surface, expecting some immediate response. A siren, a flash of emergency lighting, perhaps even a voice announcing countermeasures being deployed. Nothing happened. He pressed again, harder this time, the soft pad of his finger flattening against the unyielding surface. Still nothing. Frustration mounted within him. a sensation so foreign to his typically placid Delurian temperament that it felt almost like a physical presence in the room with him. A third attempt, pressing with such force that his finger joint bent painfully backward. The button refused to yield, to compress, to perform whatever function it had been designed for. Zetrix Var leaned closer, examining it in the dim light. The vibrant red color remained perfect, unblemished by time, but the mechanism beneath appeared to have fused with age. Decades, perhaps centuries, of disuse had rendered the button's internal components as solid and unmoving as stone.
Activate!
He shouted at it, abandoning dignity in his expression.
Emergency! Invasion! Whatever you're supposed to recognize, do it now!
The absurdity of shouting at an inanimate object was lost on him, even in his agitated state. But what else could he do? The unthinkable was happening. Unknown vessels approaching Deluria, and the only defense system he knew of refused to function. Frustration built within him like pressure in a sealed container. His species was not prone to physical outbursts. Their evolutionary path had favored reasoned discussion and compromise over aggression. Yet in this moment, with 15 red dots advancing on his homeworld and a useless button mocking his efforts, something unprecedented stirred in Zetrix Var. Without conscious thought, his right foot lifted and shot forward, striking the panel beneath the button with a force that sent pain shooting up his leg. The action was so uncharacteristic of his species that he momentarily forgot the crisis at hand, shocked by his own behavior. No Delurian he knew had ever resolved a problem by kicking it. Yet, somehow, impossibly, it worked. The impact seemed to jar something loose within the ancient mechanism. The button sank a quarter unit into its housing, with a deep, satisfying click that reverberated through the observation cabin like the toll of a ceremonial bell. Lights that Zetrix Var had never seen active suddenly illuminated around the perimeter of the room, bathing everything in a pulsing amber glow. And then, most surprising of all, a section of wall that he had always assumed was merely decorative paneling slid aside with the grinding protest of long-dormant machinery. Behind it lay a screen, large, flat, and covered in a layer of dust so thick that Zetrix Var could not immediately determine if it was operational. He approached cautiously, his curiosity momentarily overriding his alarm. The screen flickered to life as he drew near, dust falling away in sheets as vibrations awakened the display. A progress bar appeared, filling incrementally from left to right beneath unfamiliar script. Above it, a logo materialized, a blue planet with swirling white patterns across its surface, surrounded by a ring of stars. Zetrix Var stared, uncomprehending. The symbols that appeared beneath the planet were unlike any language he had encountered in his studies, the character too simple, but the full meaning impossible to understand. If he could read that, he would see the phrase, Human Commonwealth Defense Network, and below that, Connection in Progress. Humans. That single word triggered some distant memory from his academic studies. An aggressive, bipedal species from a water-rich world in a distant arm of the galaxy. They had been mentioned in historical texts covering the period before Deluria's self-imposed isolation, but only in passing. Yet here was their writing, their symbol, appearing in response to the activation of Deluria's most secured emergency protocol. Before Zetrix Var could process this revelation, the progress bar completed its journey, and the screen changed. Now, it displayed a grid of smaller images, faces, he realized after a moment. Human faces, arranged in a pattern that suggested organization or hierarchy. One of these faces suddenly enlarged to fill the screen, and sound emerged from speakers Zetrix Var hadn't known existed in the observation cabin. "Hello? Is this channel active?" The voice spoke in heavily accented but recognizable modern Delurian. The face belonged to a human female, judging by the characteristics that Zetrix var vaguely recalled from xenobiology texts. Her skin was a uniform tan color, lacking the hues of his own species. Her hands moved across controls, just visible at the bottom of the screen. Her eyes were rimmed with dark pigment that seemed artificial.
Yes?
Zetrix var responded, his voice catching in his tertiary vocal sac.
This channel is active. I am Skywatcher Zetrix var of Deluria.
The human female's expression shifted in a way Zetrix var couldn't interpret. Her lipless mouth curved upward at the corners. Deluria? Hold on. She turned away from the screen, calling to someone outside its range. Hey, Marcus, do we have a Deluria in the network? I'm getting an emergency ping from there. She turned back to the screen. Sorry about that. I'm Jessica, communications operator, Human Commonwealth Defense Force. We don't get many calls from... where did you say again?
Deluria?
Zetrix var repeated, a growing sense of unreality enveloping him.
We have detected 15 unidentified vessels entering our system. I've activated the emergency protocol as per my duties as Skywatcher.
Jessica's expression shifted again, her forehead creasing. Skywatcher? Is that like a planetary defense position?
Yes,
Zetrix var said, deciding that an explanation of the role's diminished importance in modern Delurian society would only complicate matters.
We are under potential invasion and require assistance.
The human turned away again. Marcus, are you finding anything? Deluria, emergency protocol activation. She listened to a response Zetrix var couldn't hear, then shook her head. Nothing's coming up in the current registry. Check the legacy systems? Zetrix var studied the space visible behind her as she worked. The Human Operations Center was vastly different from his austere observation cabin. Multiple screens displayed information in the same unfamiliar script. Other humans moved in the background, their forms passing in and out of view as they attended to their duties. The lighting was harsh and uniformly bright. Sir? Jessica was addressing someone new, someone Zetrix var couldn't see. We've got an emergency ping from somewhere called Deluria. It's not in our active registry, but Marcus is checking the legacy archives. She listened, then turned back to Zetrix var. My supervisor wants to know when your world joined the Commonwealth Defense Network.
I don't know,
Zetrix var admitted.
This emergency system predates my appointment, possibly predates my birth. Our world has been isolated for generations.
Jessica's expression suggested this answer was less than helpful. Hold, please, she said, and the screen divided, her image shrinking to one corner while a simple graphic, the same blue planet from earlier, occupied the rest of the display. Zetrix var waited, anxiety building as he imagined the 15 red dots continuing their inexorable approach. What if these humans decided not to help? What if the connection was severed? Did Deluria have any other defenses he wasn't aware of? After what seemed an eternity, but was likely only a few minutes according to the chronometer on the main console, Jessica's face expanded to fill the screen again. I'm transferring you to Special Operations, she said. They've located your system in the deep archives. Good luck with your situation. The screen flickered, and Jessica was replaced by a different human. This one appeared male, with a darker complexion, and facial hair covering the lower portion of his face. He wore a uniform more elaborate than Jessica's, with insignia that Zetrix var assumed indicated higher rank. This is Commander Christopher Ortiz, Special Operations Division, Extraterrestrial Affairs. The new human said, his Delurian even more heavily accented than Jessica's, but still comprehensible. I understand Deluria is experiencing an emergency situation. Please provide details. Zetrix var repeated his report, adding what little information he could about the approaching vessel's trajectory and speed. As he spoke, he noticed Commander Ortiz consulting another screen not visible in the transmission. Yes, I see it now, the commander said when Zetrix var had finished. Deloria. Your world has signed a mutual defense treaty with the human commonwealth in 2276 standard. That would be approximately 873 cycles ago in your measurement.
800?
Zetrix Var couldn't hide his shock.
That predates our reclusive period, after the disagreement with the Galactic Council.
Which no longer exists, by the way, Commander Ortiz interjected. It was dissolved approximately 400 standard years ago following the Third Rim conflict. This was too much information for Zetrix Var to process at once. His species hadn't received news from beyond their system in generations, maintaining only the most basic stellar cartography for their own infrequent interplanetary travel. The very idea that the political entity they had withdrawn from had ceased to exist centuries ago was staggering.
Commander,
he said, forcing himself to focus on the immediate crisis.
Regardless of ancient treaties, my world faces an invasion force. We have no military capability. Our society has been peaceful for so long that we've lost even the concept of warfare.
And you're certain these vessels are hostile? Commander Ortiz asked, his tone professional but skeptical.
They've entered our system without authorization and are proceeding toward our homeworld,
Zetrix Var replied.
Their configuration matches no known DeLorean vessel patterns. What else could they be?
The commander considered this. There are many spacefaring species who might have innocent reasons for entering your system. Explorers, traders seeking new markets, refugees from conflict zones.
But they haven't responded to...
Zetrix Var trailed off, realizing he hadn't actually attempted to communicate with the approaching vessels. The emergency button had been his first and only response. Embarrassment washed over him, coloring his translucent skin a deeper shade of blue.
I haven't tried to contact them.
Commander Ortiz's expression suggested he wasn't surprised by this admission. Do you have communication capability from your position?
No,
Zetrix Var said, looking around the observation cabin with new eyes.
This facility is for monitoring only. Our communication hub is in the central government complex in Celestia.
I see. The commander made a note on something outside the screen's view. Well, regardless of whether these vessels represent an actual invasion force, the treaty is quite clear. The human commonwealth is obligated to respond to any request for defense assistance from Deloria. He paused, then added with a hint of what Zetrix Var thought might be eagerness. To be honest, we haven't had a legitimate opportunity to deploy our newer defense systems in a combat scenario. Most conflicts these days are resolved diplomatically, before military intervention becomes necessary. Zetrix Var wasn't sure how to feel about his planet's crisis being viewed as a welcome opportunity.
So, will you help us?
The treaty will be honored, Commander Ortiz confirmed. Humanity prides itself on maintaining its interstellar commitments, even ones made generations ago with partners we've had no contact with since. He looked down at his unseen display again. Based on the trajectory data you've provided, and accounting for standard faster-than-light travel protocols through your system, we can have a response vessel at your coordinates within 16 hours.
16 hours?
Zetrix Var's anxiety spiked.
The unknown vessels will approach our planet well before that.
Their current speed suggests they'll achieve orbit around Deloria in approximately 12 hours. Commander Ortiz agreed. However, our response vessel will be significant. If these are merely unauthorized visitors, the sight of a human Commonwealth warship should be sufficient deterrent to any hostile actions. If they are actually an invasion force... The commander's mouth formed the same upward curve Zetrix Var had seen on Jessica's face earlier. Well, they'll have about 4 hours to reconsider their choices before our arrival.
A warship?
Zetrix Var repeated, the foreign concept difficult to grasp. His species had never developed military spacecraft. Their limited interstellar capabilities focused entirely on exploration and resource acquisition. Yes, Commander Ortiz said, his tone shifting to something that struck Zetrix Var as almost reverential. The HCS Inevitable, a heavy destroyer, currently on patrol in the Taurus Arm, about 14 light-years from your position. None of these terms meant anything to Zetrix Var, but the commander's demeanor conveyed their significance clearly enough. "I'll alert your government to expect our transmission," Commander Ortiz continued. "They should begin preparations for the arrival of both the unknown vessels and our response force." He paused, seeming to consider something. "Skywatcher Var, given your world's long isolation, I feel I should warn you. Human military technology has advanced considerably since our treaty was signed. The vessel we're sending is, well, it might be somewhat overwhelming to witnesses unfamiliar with modern space combat capabilities." Zetrix Var tried to imagine what the commander was describing, but found his knowledge of such matters woefully inadequate.
"We are grateful for any assistance,"
he said simply. Commander Ortiz nodded, then leaned slightly closer to the screen, his voice taking on a more formal cadence. "On behalf of the Human Commonwealth, and in accordance with Treaty 2276-D3, I hereby acknowledge your request for military aid. Be advised that Delurians should prepare for the arrival of Commonwealth defense forces." His expression shifted subtly, a gleam appearing in his eyes that Zetrix Var couldn't interpret. "Brace yourself, a human warship is incoming." The screen went blank, leaving Zetrix Var alone with the implications of what had just transpired. Outside the observation tower's windows, the lights of Celestia continued their normal patterns. The city's inhabitants, unaware that their 8 centuries of peaceful isolation were about to end in spectacular fashion. 15 hours and 45 minutes had passed since Zetrix Var had pressed the red button. Now he found himself kneeling beside President Zon Trid on the polished marble floor of the Grand Hall, the most sacred chamber in the Delurian capital. The space, a dome of transparent glass designed for ceremonial gatherings, had been commandeered as a throne room by their conquerors, their looming ship visible outside. Chief Strodar of the Drakari paced before them, his massive scaled form scaring them with every step. Unlike the slender Delurians, the Drakari were powerfully built reptilians with overlapping plates of keratin armor naturally fused to their muscular bodies. Strodar's scales were mostly golden, but not without scars, marks of high rank among his kind. A ridge of bony protrusions ran from the crown of his angular head down his spine, terminating in a heavy whip-like tail that he was currently using to torment President Zon Trid.
"In all my cycles as war chief,"
Strodar boasted to his subordinates who stood at attention behind him,
"never have I claimed a world with such ease."
His voice was a rumbling bass that seemed to vibrate the very air.
"No resistance, no negotiation, simply unconditional surrender the moment our ships entered orbit."
He turned sharply, his tail lashing out to strike President Zon Trid across the shoulders. The elderly Delurian flinched but remained silent, his eyes downcast. Unlike Zetrix Var's blue-violet coloration, the President's skin was a pale green that had grown increasingly ashen during their captivity.
"Their leader,"
Strodar continued, gesturing dismissively at Zon Trid,
"contacted us himself to beg for mercy before we had even deployed our first dropship."
The Drakari soldiers behind him erupted in hissing laughter, their forked tongues flickering between razor-sharp teeth. Strodar's tail whipped out again, catching the President on his right side. Another round of laughter followed. Zetrix Var kept his gaze fixed on the chronometer, embedded in the wall behind Strodar's makeshift throne, a chair hastily assembled from ornamental Delurian artifacts. 16 hours. That had been Commander Ortiz's promise. 16 hours until the human warship arrived. President Zon Trid had been skeptical when Zetrix Var had burst into the executive chambers 15 hours ago with his wild tale of approaching vessels and ancient defense treaties. But the radar evidence had been undeniable. and the President had kept the Skywatcher close.
"Just in case,"
he had said, even as he prepared the surrender declaration that he believed would spare his people from violence. Now both of them knelt as prisoners, representatives of a conquered world, while their captor gloated over his bloodless victory.
"The most remarkable part,"
Strodar said, abandoning his torment of the President to address his troops more directly,
"is that our fleet remains in high orbit. The planetary defense grid is intact in our control room. But not a single anti-spacecraft weapon was activated. Their civilization surrendered completely before a single Drakari foot touched their soil."
He spread his 4-digited hands wide.
"A conquest without peril in the annals of the Scar Nebula."
Zetrix Var continued counting the minutes silently. Would the humans be precise? Would they come at all? After nearly an hour of being ignored by Strodar, who seemed to take particular pleasure in terrorizing President Zon Trid, the war chief's attention finally turned to the Skywatcher.
"And what of this one?"
Strodar loomed over Zetrix Var, his sulphurous breath hot on the DeLorean's face.
"Is he your second in command, old one? The successor to your throne of cowardice?"
President Zontrid's voice was barely audible.
"No, War Chief. He is merely a Skywatcher."
"A Skywatcher?"
Strodar's scaled brow ridges rose.
"What manner of position is this?"
"I monitor our orbital space for anomalies,"
Zetrix Var explained, struggling to keep his voice steady.
"It is perhaps the lowest status position in our society, and nothing close to second in command."
Strodar circled him slowly, tail dragging across the polished floor.
"I don't believe you,"
he said finally.
"You hold yourself differently than the others. Your gaze—"
He bent down, massive head tilting to examine Zetrix Var's 3 eyes.
"It's not a warrior's gaze, certainly, but there is something there, a hint of anticipation, hope."
He straightened, towering over the kneeling DeLorean.
"Tell me, Skywatcher, what do you hope for in this moment of your world's defeat?"
Zetrix Var's mind raced. How should he answer? Should he reveal the expected arrival of the human warship? Would that prompt the Drakari to take defensive measures? Or would they simply execute him and the President on the spot? As he struggled to formulate a response, his gaze drifted upward, through the transparent dome that crowned the Grand Hall. The sun of Deluria Prime was setting, painting the sky in gradients of amber and violet, and there, just visible through a break in the clouds, a pinpoint of light that wasn't a star.
"Look up to the sky and you'll see,"
Zetrix Var said simply. Strodar's head snapped upward, following the direction of Zetrix Var's gaze. His yellow eyes narrowed.
"What is that?"
Before anyone could answer, the pinpoint expanded, not gradually, not with the steady approach of a distant vessel, but instantaneously, as though something massive had suddenly materialized directly in Deluria Prime's upper atmosphere. The appearance was accompanied by a simple shockwave that rippled through the clouds, pushing them outward in a perfect circle from the center of the disturbance. Even through the insulated dome of the Grand Hall, they heard the thunder of displaced air. "By the 13 teeth!" one of the Drakari soldiers gasped. "What is that?" Hovering in the sky was a vessel unlike anything Zetrix Var had imagined. It was vast, at least 3 times the size of the Drakari mothership that loomed over Calestia. Its design defied DeLorean aesthetic sensibilities. All sharp angles and aggressive protrusions, nothing harmonious about it.
"Who is that?"
Strodar snarled, activating a communication device on his wrist.
"All ships, battle stations, unknown vessel has entered the atmosphere. Open fire immediately."
For a moment, Zetrix Var expected to witness a space battle above his homeworld. Instead, 10 points of brilliant light erupted from the human vessel, streaking toward the orbital Drakari fleet. Before anyone could process what was happening, a translucent field enveloped the Drakari mothership, hovering above the city. The massive disc-shaped craft seemed to waver, like an image viewed through heat distortion, and then, in the blink of an eye, simply vanished. No explosion, no dramatic fragmentation. One moment the mothership dominated the skyline, the next, empty air had replaced it. Similar phenomena must have occurred in orbit, as the lights on Strodar's wrist device went dark one by one in rapid succession. Silence fell over the grand hall. Strodar stared upward, mandibles working silently, as if trying to form words that wouldn't come. Then a voice filled the chamber, emanating from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. "This is Captain Lau, of the Human Commonwealth vessel, Inevitable Consequence. Deluria Prime has been freed from invasion. The Human Commonwealth has honored its treaty obligations. The Drakari fleet has been neutralized." Strodar turned slowly to face President Zon Trid and Zetrix Var, his reptilian features slack with shock.
What have you done?"
the war chief whispered.
"How did weaklings like you secure an alliance with the humans? They are ancient, powerful. No species dares encroach on their protectorates."
Zetrix Var and President Zon Trid exchanged awkward glances.
"We don't know,"
the president admitted, rising shakily to his feet as he realized their captivity had ended.
"Our ancestors signed a treaty so long ago that we forgot it existed." "Then how did you summon them?"
Strodar demanded, his earlier arrogance replaced by desperate confusion. Zetrix Var stood as well, a strange calm settling over him as he considered the absurdity of the situation.
"I pressed a button," he said. "A big red button that's been gathering dust for centuries."
The war chief's eyes darted frantically between the president and the Skywatcher, desperate to understand how such an insignificant world had summoned the most feared military force in the galaxy, obviously not believing what Zetrix Var had told him. Outside, the citizens of Celestia emerged to witness the Human Commonwealth vessel hovering protectively in their sky, a silent guardian that had appeared precisely when needed. As the last rays of Deluria's sun painted the grand hall in gentle light, Zetrix Var realized that his once monotonous life had become the pivot point upon which his entire civilization's future had turned, all because he had noticed some small red dots and managed to press a simple, old red button.